I noticed it before anyone else did. The pause. The slight tightening of her smile as she scanned the room and realized she had to introduce me. We were standing near the long table set with white linen and soft lights, the kind of place where success spoke quietly through posture and polish. She touched my arm briefly, then let it fall, as if contact itself needed explanation. "This is my father," she said, after a breath too many. No name. No story. Just a role, delivered quickly. Before turning back to her colleagues, I had dressed the way I always did. Clean shoes, pressed shirt, a jacket chosen for warmth rather than impression. At my age, comfort had become a form of honesty. I was past 60 then, long past the need to announce myself. Silence had served me better than explanation ever had. I watched her lean slightly away, angling her body as though distance could soften association. It stung, but not in the way people imagine. There was no anger in me, no urge to correct her. Only a quiet recognition of something that had been forming for years. She wasn't ashamed of me, not really. She was afraid of what I represented in a world that measured worth loudly. Years of choosing restraint over display had trained me for moments like this one. I held my glass, nodded when spoken to, and let the moment pass. She thought I owned nothing. I let her believe it. I grew up believing that effort should always outlast excitement. My early adulthood was shaped by routines most people found dull: early mornings, careful notes, money set aside instead of spent. I worked jobs that demanded patience rather than applause, learning systems from the inside, understanding how small decisions compounded over time. While others chased quick rewards, I learned to wait. Waiting taught me discipline. Discipline taught me freedom. When my daughter was born, that same philosophy guided every choice I made. I never wanted her to feel uncertainty, but I also never wanted her to believe that comfort. RT came from excess. Our home was modest, predictable, and steady. The lights were always on. The fridge was never empty. Birthdays were marked with presents, not spectacle. I paid attention to school meetings, packed lunches, quiet conversations at night. When she needed reassurance more than advice, I could have given her more in ways that were visible. I chose not to. Stability felt like a better inheritance than display. I wanted her to grow up trusting the ground beneath her feet, not dazzled by surfaces that cracked under pressure. Consistency became my language of love. Over the years, my work grew quietly. Ownership came not from ambition, but from patience, investments made when no one was watching, properties bought before they were desirable, partnerships built on reliability rather than charm. I learned early that the loudest person in the room rarely controls it. True power preferred shadows. It didn't need to announce itself to be real. As a child, she admired that steadiness. She used to sit beside me while I balanced papers or checked figures, asking questions that wandered far beyond numbers. I was her anchor then, the person who made sense of things. Somewhere along the way, that admiration began to shift. It happened gradually, without a single moment to point to. New schools, new friends, new standards of success. She learned to notice labels, to compare houses, to read meaning into appearances. The things that once felt grounding began to look plain. My silence started to feel like absence. My restraint, like limitation. I didn't argue with her changing world. Each generation needs to test its values. I watched her grow confident, articulate, ambitious. I was proud of her drive, even when it created distance. When she talked about futures filled with visibility and recognition, I listened. I never corrected her assumptions about me. Not because I was hiding, but because I believed understanding arrived best on its own time. There were moments I sensed he shift more clearly, when she stopped asking for my opinion, when invitations became optional, when her tone softened into politeness. None of it was cruel. It was simply movement, like a tide pulling outward. I stayed where I was, rooted in choices I had made long before she could understand them. I believed then, and still do, that time reveals intentions better than explanations ever can. Foundations are poured quietly, out of sight, long before anyone praises the structure above them. I accepted the loneliness of that truth, trusting patience the way others trust noise. It was not bitterness that kept me silent, but faith in choices already made and confidence that clarity would arrive without being summoned by me or anyone else in due time. Always, the space between us widened gently, without conflict. There were no slammed doors, no cruel words. Just a subtle recalibration of importance. I remained steady, watching as admiration slowly turned into something more complicated. That was the first crack, not in our bond, but in how she saw me. When success became a wall, her success arrived the way spring does in cities, sudden, visible, and loud enough that everyone noticed. University led to internships, internships to positions with titles that sounded important even before they meant anything. She learned to speak in confident shorthand, to move through rooms as if she belonged there. Her social circle expanded quickly, filling with people who discussed markets, vacations, and futures with practiced ease. I watched from a careful distance, proud of her momentum, aware that acceleration always changes direction. With that change came comparison. It started subtly, almost innocently. Stories about friends' parents who owned companies, wore watches worth more than my car, hosted gatherings in homes that felt like hotels. She didn't criticize me directly. She didn't have to. The contrast did the work on its own. I became a quiet reference point against louder examples. Why life, once steady, began to look small beside theirs. The defining moment came wrapped in politeness. She was hosting a professional event, nothing extravagant, but important to her. When she called to invite me, her voice carried hesitation disguised as concern. She suggested I might be more comfortable staying home, that the evening would be very corporate. When I insisted, gently, she paused and added that maybe I should dress a bit differently this time. Nothing specific, just an implication that my usual choices might reflect poorly. Later that night, standing among her colleagues, I heard it again. Someone asked who I was, and she answered quickly, my father. He's retired. The word landed heavier than it should have. Retired from what, I wondered. From visibility? From relevance? From the story she was telling about herself, I felt the wound immediately, sharp but contained. Years of restraint had taught me how to hold discomfort without letting it spill. I smiled when spoken to. I asked polite questions. I did not correct her. I did not explain my past or justify my present. Silence, in that moment, felt like the only dignified response. Driving home afterward, the weight settled more fully. It wasn't anger that filled the car, but grief. Not for myself, but for the narrowing of her vision. She had learned to read success through surfaces, to measure worth by signals that demanded attention. I understood how that happened. The world teaches it relentlessly. I thought about all the years I had chosen invisibility over recognition, substance over display. Those choices had given me freedom, but they had also created a version of me that didn't translate easily in her new world. I realized then that I hadn't lost her to ambition. I hadn't lost her to independence or growth. I had lost her to appearances. That understanding changed something in me. Not my love for her, but my posture. I stopped volunteering information. I declined invitations that felt obligatory. I listened more than I spoke. It wasn't punishment or retreat. It was adjustment. Observation. If she needed distance to become who she was becoming, I would give it without protest. I watched her navigate rooms that intimidated me by design, watched her learn the rhythms of power and presentation. I remained where I was, steady, quiet, and unseen. The wall between us had not been built in a single moment, but I could see its outline clearly now. And instead of trying to climb it, I stepped back, trusting that time, not argument, would eventually reveal what walls were made of. There were evenings afterward when I replayed small conversations in my head, searching for a different response I might have given. Not sharper, not defensive, just clearer. Each time, I reached the same conclusion. Any explanation offered too early would have sounded like excuse. Any correction would have felt like competition. I had no desire to compete with my own child. So I chose the harder patience, the kind that requires faith without evidence. I told myself that success was a season, not a verdict, and that love, if it was real, could survive misunderstanding without demanding immediate recognition. I carried that decision quietly, like a kept promise, unsure when or how it would finally be tested again. I never told her what my days actually looked like. While she imagined retirement as a slow fading, my mornings still began before sunrise. Quiet has a way of sharpening focus. In those early hours, when the world hadn't yet begun performing for itself, I reviewed numbers, signed documents, and made decisions that rippled outward without ever pointing back to me. My life's work had never lived in a single office or title. It existed in layers, investments placed patiently years before trends made them obvious, properties purchased when neighborhoods were still overlooked, small companies supported when banks dismissed them as risks. I learned early that visibility attracts noise, and noise attracts problems. So I stayed invisible by design. In an old cabinet at home, there are ledgers whose pages have yellowed with time. Keys, each tagged with handwriting I recognize as my own from different decades. Folders thick with agreements that don't announce themselves until they're needed. None of it looks impressive laid out on a table. That was always the point. Power that needs to be displayed is already asking for permission. People assume secrecy is about hiding something shameful. For me, it was about protection. Freedom to move without explanation. Safety from entitlement and expectation. Control over decisions that affected not just profit, but people. When you own quietly, you choose deliberately. You're not pressured by applause or fear of losing face. Humility isn't an act when no one is watching. Ownership, as I understood it, was never about domination. It was stewardship. Responsibility for outcomes that extended beyond my own comfort. I had employees whose families depended on steady leadership, tenants who needed consistency more than charm, partners who valued reliability over charisma. Loud ownership unsettles those things. Quiet ownership preserves them. Even as distance grew between my daughter and me, my support for her never stopped. It simply changed form. Tuition paid without fanfare. Opportunities opened through conversations she never heard about. Safety nets placed where she would never see them unless she fell. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted freedom for her, the kind that comes from not knowing how close the ground really is. There were moments I considered telling her everything. Sitting her down, laying the facts out cleanly, watching her recalibrate her image of me. Each time, something held me back. Not pride. Not fear. Timing. Truth, when delivered before it's needed, often sounds like justification. I refused to let my life become an argument. So I kept my silence and maintained my routines. Quiet offices where my name appeared. On doors few people read. Early meetings finished before most people woke. Decisions made without ceremony. I learned to measure days not by recognition, but by whether things held together as they should. I understood that silence can look like absence to those who equate value with display. I accepted that risk when I chose this path. Still, I believed that meaning doesn't disappear just because it isn't announced. It waits. What I didn't know then was how quickly patience would be tested. The worlds we were moving in, hers loud and visible, mine contained and unseen, were drawing closer to the same point. Lines that had never crossed before were beginning to overlap. A decision she thought was hers alone brushed against structures I had built long before she entered that room. I felt the shift before it happened, the way you sense pressure change before a storm. Silence had protected me for years, but it was about to be interrupted. Not by my choice, and not by hers, but by the simple fact that quiet foundations eventually surface when enough weight is placed upon them. I remained calm in that knowledge, even as signs accumulated. Invitations mentioned addresses I recognized. Documents crossed desks I had once cleared. Threads long kept separate were tightening toward a single knot. I did nothing to hasten it. I had learned that inevitability doesn't need help. It only needs time, and time, when respected, reveals everything without raising its voice. I waited, understanding that restraint often speaks loudest when circumstances remove all alternatives. The meeting was meant to celebrate her. A closing dinner, formal but optimistic, marking the final signatures on a development project she had spent months negotiating. The room was polished in the way ambition prefers: glass walls, low voices, confidence dressed as ease. I attended because she asked me to, this time without hesitation, as if proximity no longer required justification. We were seated near the end of the table. I listened more than I spoke, content to observe. When the senior partner arrived late, conversation paused instinctively. He moved with familiarity, greeting several people by name before stopping when he reached me. He smiled, extended his hand, and said my name clearly, with the ease of someone who had said it many times before. "I'm glad you could make it," he said. "We wouldn't be here without your early backing." The room shifted. Not abruptly, but noticeably, like furniture being rearranged without sound. Folders were opened. Documents passed. My name appeared on the first page, printed in a place that needed no explanation. Titles followed, understated but precise. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. I felt her attention before I saw her face. She was still, eyes moving between the papers and me, recalculating something fundamental. I didn't look at her immediately. I answered questions when asked, clarified points briefly, declined credit where it wasn't necessary. There was no reveal to perform. The truth had simply arrived. The conversation continued, but its center had moved. Decisions were framed differently now, careful, deferential. When opinions were offered, they paused until I nodded or didn't. I noticed her breathing change, shallow at first, then slower, as understanding settled into place. Shock gave way to confusion. Confusion softened into recognition. I could see it unfolding in her posture, the way her shoulders eased and then stiffened again, as if carrying two conflicting histories at once. The man she thought she knew and the one now evident in the room refused to align neatly. No one looked at her. No one needed to. This wasn't a performance meant to instruct her. It was simply reality continuing without concern for timing. I signed where indicated, closed the folder, and listened as plans were discussed that stretched far beyond the evening. When the meeting ended, people lingered, offering thanks, exchanging quiet acknowledgments. I accepted them politely and said little. She stood beside me, silent, watching the room empty with a different awareness than when it had filled. We walked out together into the cool night. She didn't speak at first. Neither did I. Recognition doesn't always arrive with words. Sometimes it settles like weight, requiring space to adjust. I in the car, she finally turned to me. There were questions in her eyes, but no accusations. No defensiveness. Just the fragile edge of understanding finding its footing. I met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the road. That night changed nothing about who I was. It changed only what could no longer be unseen. The distance between us hadn't vanished, but it had been redefined. The wall she had built from appearances now showed its seams. I drove steadily, aware that the hardest part was still ahead, not the revelation itself, but what came after, when recognition demands response. After we got home, she sat at the kitchen table the way she used to when she was younger, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The house was quiet, familiar, unchanged, and yet everything between us felt newly fragile. She spoke once, stopped, then tried again. Words that had always come easily to her now seemed heavier, as if each one needed permission to exist. I didn't know, she aid finally. It wasn't a defense, just a statement. I nodded, because it was true in every way that mattered. She asked careful questions, not about numbers or titles, but about why I never told her, why I let her believe what she did. I listened without interrupting, the way I had learned to listen long before she was born. I told her that ambition wasn't a flaw. That wanting more from life was not something she needed to apologize for. I said I admired her drive, her courage to step into rooms that demanded confidence. I also told her that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's patience. She looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for years she had skipped over too quickly. There was a moment when her voice broke. Not loudly. Just enough to betray the strain of holding an image that no longer fit. She said she was sorry, not for what she thought, but for how she had treated me because of it. I didn't rush to answer. Forgiveness, I've learned, loses its meaning when delivered too quickly. We sat together in that space, letting the weight settle. I reminded her that every generation misjudges the one before it. That distance doesn't always come from disrespect, but from pressure to belong somewhere new. I told her I never needed her admiration, only her honesty. Tears came then, quietly, without spectacle. She wiped them away and laughed softly at herself, embarrassed by the release. I reached across the table and took her hand. It felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had finally noticed how much time had passed. I told her that nothing she had done erased who she was to me. That love isn't measured by how well we understand each other at every moment, but by whether we stay when understanding falters. That night didn't resolve everything. It wasn't meant to. It opened a door that had been closed gently, not locked. As she left, she paused, hugged me longer than usual, and whispered thank you. I watched her go with a calm I hadn't felt in years, knowing that reckoning had softened into something steadier. Reflection had begun, and healing no longer felt like an idea, but a direction. We both understood that trust would rebuild slowly, through ordinary conversations, shared meals, and unremarkable days that proved consistency mattered more than explanations, and presence more than proof. Those were things I had always offered, quietly, and now she could finally see them clearly and honestly. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges without announcing the work. Months passed. Then a year. We settled into something quieter than repair, something closer to understanding. Our conversations returned, not dramatic or confessional, but ordinary. Calls to check in. Meals without an agenda. The kind of familiarity that doesn't demand proof. Trust, I learned again, rebuilds through repetition, not revelation. She began to speak differently about success. Not dismissively, but thoughtfully. Stories about work shifted from titles to people, from outcomes to consequences. She noticed things she hadn't before, the strain behind ambition, the cost of constant display. Once, she asked how I decided what was enough. I told her enough is when your life doesn't need explaining. She nodded, and didn't ask for more. I watched her recalibrate without forcing direction. Pride, when earned quietly, doesn't need instruction. She still moved confidently in her world, but she carried herself with less urgency. Less comparison. Worth had become something internal, measured against values rather than mirrors. That change mattered more to me than any apology ever could. As for me, I thought more about legacy than ownership. Buildings change hands. Accounts move. What remains is posture. The way you treat people when you don't need anything from them. The way you choose restraint even when recognition is offered freely. Dignity, I've learned, isn't the absence of power. It's the decision not to use it to impress. I regretted my silence. It protected more than it cost. It taught her a lesson I could never have explained without sounding defensive. Wealth that needs to be announced is fragile, dependent on attention. Wealth that serves quietly endures, because it's built to last rather than to be seen. We still don't talk about that night often. We don't need to. Understanding doesn't require repetition once it's settled. When she visits now, she introduces me by name. Sometimes she adds stories. Sometimes she doesn't. Both feel right. I once believed patience was a solitary virtue. Now I see it as a shared inheritance. She learned I owned buildings. I learned she finally saw the man inside them.